Good morning, everyone. I invite you to take your seats, please. We're going to begin. Hello and welcome. My name is Megan DeDios, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thank you for joining us for this final lecture in our Fall 2023 Continuing Education Lecture Series. We thank you for your engagement throughout this semester, both in person and virtually. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this with on-campus presentations, just like this one, as well as online courses, webinars, videos, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Today, the School of Theology and Ministry is pleased to host this Annual Ministry Renewal Day for our alumni, students, and friends. This tradition was initiated as a day to take a break from the stresses and strains of the work of ministry and to focus on renewal and well-being. Today is an opportunity to come together as a community of servant leaders, to experience and discuss new ideas, and to fill your own spiritual well. It is our hope that you will come away with a measure of new energy to sustain your ministry in an ongoing way. I now invite Father Michael McCarthy, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Annual Ministry Renewal Day presentation, Catholic Resources for Trauma Mitigation. It's my pleasure to introduce an esteemed and dear colleague and today's speaker. Heather DuBois is an assistant professor of peace studies, trauma, and spirituality here at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who specializes in critical, constructive responses to conflict, trauma, and violence. Heather holds an undergraduate degree in English and political science, a master's degrees in conflict resolution and theology, and a doctorate in theology and peace studies. Before joining us here at the STM, a very happy occasion, Professor DuBois served as postdoctoral fellow in religion, ethics, and philosophy at Florida State University, and as an assistant professor of religious studies at Stonehill College. She is writing a book that is entitled Moving Through Impasse. The book uses the spirituality of John of the Cross and the critical theory of Judith Butler to theorize transformation at the nexus of self and society. Professor DuBois has taught theology courses on suffering, evil, and social justice, as well as religion courses on gender and conflict. She is active in the Catholic Theological Society of America and in the American Academy of Religion. Before joining the Academy, she worked in the domestic and international nonprofit and NGO sources. She is a wonderful colleague, and we are delighted to have her as this year's Annual Ministry Renewal Day speaker. Please welcome Professor DuBois.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. How's that for Mike? Yeah? Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to Megan and Kara and James for putting together this event, for the folks in the back and the tables. Thank you for that prayer service, which there's a part of me that after a prayer service like that just wants to say, okay, let's just sit with that. Let's just stay there. That's a good place to be. So remember this feeling when we come to the end of our 2 hours today. It's so good to have you all here, those of you online, those of you in the room, and it's especially good to see students from past and current semesters here with me. We're going to talk about a heavy topic. There will be no detailed examples of injury or violence, but we will talk about hard feelings. In broad terms, abstract terms, we'll be talking about the experience of trauma. So I just want to normalize doing whatever might feel appropriate. If you need to take a break, if you need to take a walk, if you need to take a stretch, there's still plenty of food in the back of the room. Help yourself. I want to give you a brief outline of how you will interact before I get started. So after about 20 minutes, I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes to think on your own with the pieces of paper in front of you. Then I'll talk some more, and then you'll have some time to talk to your neighbor, sort of a pair-share thing, and we'll speak out, whoever wants to volunteer. If you want to prepare yourself, I will ask for volunteers in about half an hour. Then we'll have a break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. I'll talk again for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about a 10-minute time for you to really do some more in-depth conversation at your table, okay? So if you really don't like group work, you want to sneak out before the last 10 minutes. Okay. I have 2 objectives for us today. I hope that you experience that you already know quite a lot about healing and preventing trauma, even as we wrestle with the fact that we only know a little about healing and preventing trauma. And this is a good reminder for me to name my own background. We just had a very elaborate introduction that mentioned a lot of things. I want to highlight that all of those things fall under the humanities and social sciences. So I am not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a social worker. So if you also identify as none of those things, you can feel comfortable that we too can be in this conversation. And this points to what I'm about to say about balancing between 2 polar opposite reactions. On the one hand, we can be intimidated by trauma. We can think that we need to have training in clinical psychology to responsibly approach it. We can be so in awe of the life and death quality of trauma that we do nothing. On the other hand, we can approach trauma too easily. These days, it's discussed so frequently, it can seem like a new word for suffering. And we can be so motivated to act, to end suffering, that we rush in without enough context. I propose that we want to maintain the tension between awe and action. It is a useful tension, an instructive tension. There is something distinct about trauma. It brings us to the thin edge between life and death. And that is hard to describe. But there is also something familiar about trauma healing and prevention. As we will see, it is ultimately about relationships, about the kind of life-giving relationships to self and God and other that we want in any and every context. I took on a bit more than we can fully chew in our time together because I was excited when I was asked to send the abstract over the summer. So you may feel a little hungry when we get to the last 2 sections. Think of them as tasters to build your appetite. And indeed, we're going to have some articles for you, some further reading in the back of the room. There'll be one article that uses the work of John of the Cross to talk about spirituality and trauma, and another work that focuses on communities and structures and cultures using the Theology of Edward Skillabake. So you can pick those up as you leave. This is a picture of a hospital entrance, marking a trauma center, or what we might also call an intensive care unit. Here, trauma refers to high-impact physical wounds. When we shift to psychological trauma, we are still talking about wounding. I ask you to keep the reality of injury in mind as you think about how trauma is different from other forms of suffering. The wounding is not metaphorical. This is the manual or handbook for psychiatrists in the United States. Here, trauma is defined as high-impact threat to life or bodily integrity. This is threat that is so great that it overwhelms our capacity to respond. We are unable to stop the force that threatens us. And even after the force is no longer there, the experience of threat persists. The visceral memory of being overwhelmed has lasting impacts on agency. And by agency, I mean all of the different ways that people lead and shape and live out their own lives. When the response system is overwhelmed, it gets disorganized. The experience of threat is not integrated or metabolized. It seems to take on a life of its own. It can reappear, the threat can reappear in subtle or dramatic ways to shape our perceptions of the current moment. Or it can pull people back into previous experiences of helplessness and fear. The disorganized response system makes life unpredictable and sometimes surreal. People may not feel what they are supposed to feel when they are supposed to feel it. They may seem to live outside of the normal flow of time and space. They may struggle with trust and intimacy. Traumatic reactions can literally interfere with a person's capacity to feel fully alive. Trauma is lonely. And I want to linger on that word so that you remember it when we talk about relationships. Trauma is lonely because people are living under a threat that no one else sees or feels. I want to point out that this is the 5th revision of the DSM, and these revisions are long and controversial processes for members of this association. This is the 5th edition. It used to be that psychologists spoke of trauma in terms of singular events. Now, the field recognizes that the threat to life or bodily injury might instead be a series of events. Or sometimes the threat is a composite of many moments within ongoing conditions. It used to be that clinicians thought that trauma was extraordinary. Trauma was first developed as a diagnostic category when clinicians were working with military veterans. Today, we know that trauma is only extraordinary in the sense that it overwhelms ordinary coping mechanisms. It is not extraordinary in terms of frequency. People are threatened with death and violation and injury every day. The statistics suggest that trauma is present in every room that we enter. I think this helps us to have a new awareness of the fragility of our psychic lives, and also the complex ways in which life will defend itself against threat. The good news is that people can recover from less severe traumatic circumstances relatively quickly if they are met with care and support. The bad news is that without resources, even less severe circumstances can produce profound, lasting changes in the body, mind, and spirit. I start my talks on trauma with the DSM because it is a valuable, albeit imperfect, valuable touchstone. The word threat reminds us that safety is the primary need when it comes to trauma. With a precise definition, we can know that trauma exists in comparison to other forms of suffering. So pain, violence, injustice, oppression, burnout, compassion fatigue, anxiety, depression, moral injury, and trauma, These are all related but distinct things. I like to start with definitions, but they do set us up for a practical dilemma. Appropriate naming can bring self-liberating knowledge and motivation for community change. Inappropriate naming creates undue burdens and confuses efforts for healing change. So how do we proceed? One way to respond to the task of naming would be to double down on our efforts to figure out what exactly is trauma, so we can know who is traumatized. We could use current literature in neuroscience, anthropology, literary theory, peace studies, as well as psychology and theology. We could dive into psychiatric debates about diagnosis, and also now social media diagnosis. Another way to respond is to relativize our power to name, to hold it loosely, to put it in perspective. Because we are sufficiently in awe of the gravity of trauma, we do not want to impose or withhold the term. Because we know people need help, we can act to mitigate trauma without the details of what has happened, without satisfying the desire to use a definition. So, instead of seeking certain definitions that will tell us exactly what to do and exactly what to say, I think we can understand our opportunities and responsibilities in more modest terms. So we can focus on developing realistic expectations. I chose the word mitigation for the title of this talk for two reasons. I think that it maintains the tension between awe and action. It says that we cannot fully address trauma in society or in the church, but we can have an impact. And also, I want to emphasize that prevention and healing alike happen along a continuum. Trauma is not an on-off switch. This has been recognized in recent years with the shift in the language of trauma studies. The field has moved from a singular focus on events, so trying to understand what is traumatic, to an additional focus on process, trying to understand how and when circumstances may be traumatizing. This shift helps us to reckon with the fact that trauma is cumulative. Being traumatized is not a steady state. It is dynamic, and it is contingent upon one's environment. Those who are traumatized are at risk of re-traumatization, especially if they have not yet experienced some measure of healing and recovery. More broadly, we can say that shifting from a focus on events alone to processes also complexifies the picture of what is happening. We begin to see that whether and to what degree circumstances are traumatizing partially depends. It depends on personal and social and historical conditions. Put simply, different people can experience the same things in different ways. You can find this shift in the language in manuals created by this organization. They use a process orientation when they talk about trauma. This is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is a public health agency in the US government. We're going to use some of their materials on what they call the socio-ecological approach. Now, this approach was not invented by this organization. It actually goes back to the 1970s. It was developed by a psychologist named Bronfenbrenner, who, by the way, was one of the founders of Head Start, which is a federal education and social services agency, I'm seeing some nods, for children under the age of 5. So the figure on the screen before you has 5 concentric circles representing 5 levels of human organization. Each of these levels contains many factors that shape whether and to what degree people experience threat to life or bodily injury, how people react to the threat that they experience, whether and to what degree resources are available to mitigate traumatic reactions, what meaning people make of the threat, what meaning they make of their reactions, and what meaning they make of other people's responses to their reactions. And all of these factors are the same factors that shape whether and how people experience healing. All 5 of these levels interact with one another. That's what the long arrows are trying to indicate. They interact to create the conditions for the possibility of what might be harm or might be healing. We'll go through each of these factors with some examples to just flesh out what we mean here. First, I want to emphasize that age is really important. So all of the things that we experience as a small person have the possibility to impact us to a greater degree. So developmental age is really important. But at every age throughout the lifespan, what is relevant includes our biological physical condition, our mental health condition, personality traits, our gender socialization, coping styles, education style, education level, type of education, socioeconomic status, and we could go on. At the interpersonal level, you might think of patterns of experience and interaction with family, with peers, with significant others. We can think of the mental health conditions of those people with whom you interact. And here, whether a parent or caregiver has a history of trauma is going to be especially relevant. You can also think broadly of interpersonal social networks. At the community and organizational level, we're talking about the neighborhood, the school system, the workplace. We're talking about faith-based settings of all kinds. And also access to health care, access to transportation, the general economic status of the community. Zooming out further, at the societal level, that's all of the economic, social, and political policies. That's the media. That's the judicial system. And that really vague term, norms, social and cultural norms, all relevant. Finally, the period in history, that's going to include major events, but also societal attitudes related to trauma. So related to the type of trauma or the cause of trauma. And then also, as we've seen, professional definitions and understandings of trauma also change over time. So let me go back to the circles. Now that we have some examples to sort of flesh out what might be contained in each of those levels, we can start to think about the complexity of them all interacting. And for each level, within a ministerial setting, we can think about what kinds of religious thought and practice might be relevant. How might we fill the different levels of this model with theological, spiritual, liturgical, pastoral, educational dynamics? And in fact, this is your moment to use your piece of paper. I'm going to ask you to take about 3 minutes to do just that. On one side of your handout, you have a list of the 5 levels. Write down examples from your context related to each level. Write down theological, spiritual, educational, pastoral resources that are appropriate for each level. It can be resources or activities that you know are out there, or resources that you wish were out there, things that are relevant to each level of human organization. So we'll take about 3 minutes for that. Okay, go ahead and wrap up your notes there. It's such a gratifying thing to see people working at their tables. Okay, now that we have primed our imaginations to think in complex ways about trauma, we can say that being trauma-informed means cultivating socio-ecologies in which traumatization is less likely and healing is more likely. Specifically, we have a variety of principles that can help us make that a reality. This list of principles can help to mitigate initial traumatization, to mitigate re-traumatization, and also to mitigate vicarious or secondary trauma among helping professionals. So here's looking at all of you in the room. And there are no neat divisions amongst these persons, right? A helper may be someone who has undergone trauma healing themselves and remains at some risk of re-traumatization. So the first principle is always going to be safety. This is safety as defined by people who have experienced trauma. So developing safety in this way means actually talking to the people in the room. We might think of this kind of safety, in addition to the obvious physical safety, we can think of it as a measure of consistency to help counter the unpredictability that may be in other aspects of living in one's body and one's environment. The second principle is trustworthiness and transparency as mutually reinforcing realities. We cannot build trust without some measure of transparency. And it's good to remember that traumatized persons often have very good reasons to be slow to trust. Number 3 is peer support, and here peer means, again, people who have themselves lived experience of trauma. Peer support and mutual self-help are remarkable vehicles for all of the rest of these principles. So peer support and mutual self-help helps to establish safety and build trust, and it cultivates the hope and the collaboration that the long haul of healing really needs. Number 4, collaboration and mutuality means leveling power differentials. So not that there's no power in the room, that's never the case, but that we name and sort of mitigate or lessen great power disparities among the helpers and those who need help. Right? Again, there needs to be some experts in the room, but there are a variety of ways for those experts to hold and use their power. Everyone has a role to play in a trauma-informed organization. The Sampson materials say, quote, "One does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic," unquote. Number 5, empowerment, voice, and choice. The starting point here is the strength and resilience of victim survivors, recognizing that ambivalent and even sometimes negative coping mechanisms may be hard-earned ways of surviving. So to make this realistic, even amidst worrying behavior, the framework for change is facilitation, not control. Facilitation, not control, so that we are prioritizing empowerment and voice and choice in all that we are doing. Shared decision-making, goal setting, those kinds of things are characterizing a shared relationship for everyone in the organization. Last but not least, these kinds of organizations are actively trying to transform stereotypes and biases related to culture, history, gender issues. These trauma-informed organizations honor and incorporate the healing value of cultural and group connections and are responsive to the particular needs of some identity groups, especially in the context of historical or collective trauma. So this is a list of principles that I think is good for all of us, for every context, no matter what we're doing. And it's a list of principles that can help mitigate the trauma that's in the room. Okay, I promised that we would give you a chance to also talk. So we've been gathering information for a good 20 or so minutes. I want you to now check in with your neighbor, thinking about what you've heard so far. Ask 2 questions. what has been familiar and what has been new. So with your neighbor, discuss what has been familiar, what has been new, and we'll give this 5 minutes. Okay, once again, I'm going to ask you to wrap up this time your verbal thoughts. And we're going to gather back together. I think we have some microphones that are going to be passed around. Who would like to share a little bit from their conversation? So this is the time to share from your small space and table to the larger group. Raise your hand if anyone wants to share. The mic will come around to you. The questions were, what was familiar and what is new? Just wait for the mic. It's coming right behind you. Thank you. That way everybody can hear you and you won't have to strain your voice.
Thanks so much. So was it just the new or the familiar?
Whatever you want to share.
So one of the awarenesses that I had as a result of this exercise was, starting here in ministry in my early 20s, I was very familiar with how to tend to the individual. But lately, noticing the resources in the nonprofit, community sector, there's so much available, so much opportunity. So that might seem basic 101, but it's new to me. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Prof. I'm familiar with the principles of a trauma-informed approach, which I know in under safety, we have things like elements like flight, freeze, fight. So I'm familiar with that one because you got to fly, because if you remain there, you can be crushed. So I love that so much. Then what is new to me is the social ecological module, because when we're asked to fill in, I have COVID as one of the elements. And I know that as far as I'm concerned, life can never be the same for me with the COVID, because one of my sisters died of it and I cared for her and I caught COVID too. So the trauma was so much that I cannot get over it in a hurry. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. COVID definitely reminded us all of the interconnections that we have. Someone else want to share from their conversations at the table or their own? There we go. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Melinda Stoops. I work in student affairs, and my partner and I, we both have background in training in mental health, and so this wasn't necessarily new per se, but there were two things. I mean, one, I really appreciate the tension between awe and action, and I'm not going to phrase this exactly as you did, or maybe I will, but the idea of trauma putting us on sort of the line between life and death, and I think that's a real powerful way to look at it when we're working with people. And the other thing we talked about was, it's interesting, not to say this couldn't be embedded behind the scene on this, but it's interesting that faith is not part of this.
Thank you all for participating. Now you get to have a break. So you've got 10 minutes. Stretch, shake it out, grab some food, take a biology break. We got about 10 minutes and then we'll gather back together. Hello again. I hope you like the trees. James in the back to help me find this image. If anybody's into online documentaries, there's a great one about the underground root systems, the rhizome systems, and how when one tree is sick, the other trees can send nutrients through the root system to help it. And I really don't actually have anything to say about this image other than I really like it. So I wanted to make sure that you're soaking it up. Okay. My primary guide in learning about trauma and healing has been Judith Herman. This book was published in 1992. She is still a psychiatrist in the Boston area. And she actually just came out with a new book on truth-telling and justice from the perspective of survivors. It is on your handout under further resources. Some say that Herman is the most important trauma theorist since Freud. In this book, she made the connection between the traumatic reactions of people held in captivity by domestic violence and those held in captivity as political prisoners. Herman writes, "The core experiences of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Recovery, therefore, is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections." Herman writes about 3 stages of recovery, all of which, as we know, must happen in and through the existing socio-ecologies. And again, the first step is always safety. This is a threshold of safety. One thing that I've learned from reading peace builders who work on trauma, if you're a peace builder in a armed conflict zone that's been in recurring violence for decades, you're not going to wait until the peace accord is firmly established before you start some work of healing and recovery, right? So this is a threshold of safety. We can create zones of safety in which the work of recovery can happen. What does that safety look like? Well, at a minimum, our coping mechanisms are no longer harmful. So we are no longer habitually re-traumatizing ourselves through certain coping mechanisms. That's sort of a base. We are psychologically stable enough to do the vulnerable, painful work of stage 2. Remembrance and mourning. This can mean breaking personal, familial, and social silences to name the threat, to name the sources of the threat, and to name the bystanders. Remembering well may involve letting go of certain narratives, certain harmful or false narratives about what has happened and about who we are because of what has happened. And this stage will involve mourning many losses, including mourning what could have been had things been otherwise. The third stage, and these of course are not linear, neat, progressive stages, but the third stage is reconnection, or for some, fully connecting for the very first time. Connecting, we might say, to the self in a holistic way, living in and through the senses and body and spirit, feeling fully alive. Reconnecting to human and divine others, and this looks like joyful, trusting relationships. I'd like you to keep these stages in mind as we turn to resources within the Catholic tradition. A very simple way to define spirituality is the means and ways to facilitate greater relationship with God. And we say that knowing that the relationship to God is interdependent with relationships to self and neighbor. In the wake of trauma and amidst trauma, people struggle with relating at all. Relationality as a thing, as a part of being and doing and living can be a struggle. As we just saw, reconnection is considered a stage to which we must develop. And yet, every bit along the way, relational support helps. We can truly say that relationships are the means of healing and the means of prevention. So while we should not take for granted that a relationship with God is possible for everyone, and certainly not all of the time. For those who can pray, prayer is a way to build capacity to feel difficult feelings and think difficult thoughts, and to trust that they will be received. In prayer, our worst feelings and thoughts can be received, and we can be loved. To experience oneself as lovable can be a revolutionary experience. It counters the shame and self-blame that are often woven into traumatic meaning-making about self and others and the universe. To experience oneself as lovable can have a crucial impact because love of self is integrally related to love of others. So there's like a cycle, right? There's a beneficial or a negative cycle, because relationships, again, are the means of healing and prevention. Spiritual practices can help us to remember or discover an identity that is rooted in love. And not just an easy or an obvious love, a love that can withstand the worst of what happens. A love that knows the thin edge between life and death. You may already be thinking of the Psalms of Lament. Perhaps you're thinking of the Way of the Cross. We can think about all of our ancient and contemporary prophets. At this point, I hope you are recognizing that we're actually not doing something radically new when we talk about trauma and spirituality. The language of trauma, the study of trauma, is in many ways new, but the reality of trauma is not new. Nor is Christian reflection amidst trauma. Spirituality is a frame that can hold the weight of traumatized meaning-making. Why? Why me? Why us? These are powerful, lonely questions. They speak to the experience of displacement or abandonment that comes with living outside of the flow of time and space. They reflect the diminished agency that comes with being overwhelmed. And these why questions have a prominent place within Scripture and tradition. We might say that our job is simply to remember this, to remind one another that there is room for questions, room for doubt, and all of its accompanying emotions. But we can go further. We can prepare to be interrupted and maybe even overwhelmed. We can create religious ecologies that embrace the challenge of meaning-making under pressure, including the weight of big questions. Our spiritualities serve us best when they invite questions. Who am I? And who am I now? And who might I be? Who might we be? We do well when we invite the questions and invite complex, evolving answers. And that includes admitting that sometimes the answer is we don't really know. Traumatized meaning-making often vacillates, swings between fantasy and fatalism. On one end of the spectrum, we may be paralyzed by fear and doubt. On the other end, we may launch ourselves into a grandiose imagined future. Spiritualities are obviously diverse. Indeed, some may fit into one end of the spectrum or the other. But I would argue that at their best, spiritual traditions can help us to mitigate the pendulum swings between fatalism and fantasy. They can strengthen us to admit uncertainty and help us to endure uncertainty realistically. So realistic hope is the gift that will sustain journeys of healing. As always, the capacity of spirituality, its capacity to prevent harm and its capacity to heal depends. It depends on the local theology. So just who is the God to whom one would pray? From a variety of theologies, people might quickly say, well, God is love. Okay, But what does love look like here, in this place, for these people? If we recall the socio-ecological model, none of this is straightforward. Spiritualities exist through the ambivalence and the ambiguity of all of our resources. And this is why the work that we do to cultivate life-giving environments is always already the work of preventing and healing trauma. So the daily maintenance that you do, the daily maintenance of churches and organizations and social networks, this is when and where we live out trauma-informed principles. And this brings me to the next and last section of the talk, a set of principles for shaping and reforming those ecologies. For those of you who have not yet taken your class on Catholic social teaching, this is a collection of documents written by popes and bishops since 1891, written by these authors and yet inspired by the whole church, inspired by both ordained and lay ministers, activists, educators, scholars, professionals of all kinds. Some of the issues addressed include labor rights. That was the first encyclical, was on labor rights. Also totalitarianism, disarmament, poverty, more recently ecological crisis, and the death penalty. The audience for these documents is all people of goodwill. We might say this is a Catholic way to talk about socio-ecologies. Long before, but of course including, the encyclical Laudato Si. This is the environmental encyclical in which Pope Francis talks about integral ecology. Integral ecology. We could have another session comparing integral ecology to psychosocial, socio-ecological. You get what I'm saying here. This is a thing, right? Ecological frameworks are a thing. Catholic social teaching speaks to the fact that we are not only experiencing harm and healing through our social and material environment, we are co-creating those environments. So to underscore this explicitly, we encounter more or less potentially traumatizing conditions depending on who we are. Our social identities and geographies affect our access to material and relational resources. In the United States, we might think about class segregation and how education and social services depend on property taxes. We might think about the fact that here and around the world, discrimination and violence are unequally distributed based on race, gender and sexuality, age, disability, and so forth. It's in light of these realities that I want to highlight just 3 principles of Catholic social teaching. So the first is human dignity, and sure, recognition of human dignity seems obvious, at least in the abstract, not always so much in actual life. So it bears repeating. This is a quotation from the Second Vatican Council. With respect to the fundamental rights of the person, every type of discrimination, you've got your standard list of things that have to be factored. These have to be overcome and eradicated. Why? Because they are contrary to God's intent. This is affirming the constant inherent worth of the person. And we might say this means that there is nothing that you can do and nothing that can be done to you that makes you unworthy of love and respect. Traumatic reactions occur when we are helpless. So the inverse of that is making help available, fostering agency and autonomy in an ongoing way for everyone. Subsidiarity is my favorite Catholic social teaching. It's the one that I see mentioned the least, maybe because the word's a little bit strange. So subsidiarity, we're going to quote a theologian from Fordham University. Subsidiarity means to rely as much as possible on those solutions that are closest to the people affected. Again, think of empowerment. And at the same time, It means to recognize that there are occasions when larger bodies can make a real and indispensable contribution, right? So it matters how resources and power are distributed depending on the context and circumstances of what is going on. We might think of censoring, again, the decision-making of those experiencing trauma while holding systems and structures and cultures accountable. The last one is arguably everyone's favorite, solidarity. Pope John Paul II reminds us that this is not vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortune of others, but rather a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. Solidarity looks like taking time and making space to acknowledge the trauma that is already in every room, in every community, and present to a greater degree in some communities. Solidarity looks like committing resources to cultivate trauma-informed cultures and structures, which includes investing in personal and professional development for the people in the room. Because the know-how of these principles, the everyday practice of these principles, is something that we have to learn. We cannot take it for granted. So again, looking at these principles, we've defined trauma as psychological wounding from threat to life or bodily integrity. Here at the end, I can add that people sometimes say that the worst part is afterward. The worst part is not the traumatizing conditions and circumstances themselves, but other people's responses to what has happened. Disbelief, silence, shame, dismissal, neglect, avoidance. These are things that break trust, that corrupt love, and challenge meaning-making. Once again, relationships are the means of prevention and healing. So it's relatively easy to talk about spirituality and Catholic social teaching as resources. It's harder to learn again and again how to practice them in our mixed, ambivalent ecologies. As in every community, we have to do the essential work of critically engaging ourselves in our environment. Because if we're going to harness healing and mitigate harm, we have to develop the dispositions and processes for discerning which is which. Which is which. And so we'll end our time today with a reflective exercise where you can do just that at your tables. The last part of your handout has the 3 stages of recovery that are offered by Herman. And what I thought we could do is to take those 3 stages and use them to organize our reflection on examples of church resources and examples of church challenges. And this work I'd invite you to do with your table. So if it's hard to hear, you can pair off again, but if you can talk in a larger group, feel free to do that. You're gonna have about 7 to 10 minutes, so more time to really get into this. Using the 3 stages of recovery, talk about church resources and church challenges relevant for each stage. Is there anybody that would like to share some words of wisdom, some insights, some cool ideas? We have some microphones to go around the room. Or complaints. We can also field complaints.
You mentioned complaints, so I can stand on that because I feel like that's what we talked about the most. I was sharing about a recent encounter that I had at church. They were preaching about sexual assault. It's the first time I ever heard a sermon about sexual assault. It was like amazing, but sexual assault specifically in the context of church, like people who've been assaulted by church members. And the amount of people who were impacted, who were crying, was a lot. And it was this idea that church is supposed to be a place of safety, a place of reconnection with others, but that's also the place of trauma for many people. And maybe it's not sexual assault, but it's like very dangerous theologies that create all kinds of images of God that are not helpful, to say the least. So in many ways, the church, which is supposed to be this place of safety, is like where you come and you lay down your burdens and you do that in community, is often the source of your trauma. And so we were talking about that and the level of intentionality that's needed, because we also talked about pockets of like safety, like in really intentional small groups or support groups where people can really support one another in very intentional ways. But sometimes, unfortunately, in the church setting, we also find like people are well-meaning and have good intentions, but because of lack of education or understanding, like their execution cannot be helpful. Which kind of leads into this idea of like, we talked about remembrance and mourning and how that's really can be a struggle, because we have like this dual reality of almost shaming people for living in their suffering. Like, oh, you lack faith. You don't trust in God. If you're complaining about what you're going through, that means that you're disconnected from the divine in some way. So that's the one view. Or this kind of, let's push it aside. Like, let's think like your present sufferings cannot compare to the joy set before you. Like this idea of like, let's forget about it and like focus on the future, and this theology of great hope, but not a theology of suffering and what it means to suffer, which I thought led to this idea of reconnection. Like if you're not doing the first two, if you're not creating that environment of safety, if you're not creating a space for people to really mourn and sit with the pain and the suffering that they're going through, then reconnection or connection at all is surface level at best. So yeah, very depressing. But
very real.
the reality that I've had a lot of conversations, and it's the things that I'm hearing, that people want to connect, people want to find something, some source of hope, and I feel like the church has done steps in the right direction, but in other ways, it's like going back and forth. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Thank you very, very much. Microphone's coming.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just reflecting on the concept of solidarity, as you mentioned, and bringing up thinking about the cross and things like that from a Catholic perspective, and the idea of like the wounded healer. Obviously, I think it's important to take care of yourself when caring for those in a trauma-informed approach, to make sure that you yourself don't get, re-traumatized, re-triggered, or anything like that. But the concept of walking along with people in their suffering and holding on to your own traumas, hopefully in a healing stage at this point, if you are able to be working with someone. Just that concept of the wounded healer, I feel like that's something that ministers, people in a pastoral setting, and in other caregiving occupations can really learn a lot from. So that's what I'm thinking of. So thank you.
Thank you. We talked about that in my class yesterday.
Thank you, Professor DuBois, for your presentation. Well, I wanted to say a few things about what was sort of life-giving for our conversation, and then a question came to mind, so I'll ask a question at the end. First, I think in our conversation, we both started and ended with this idea of uncertainty and learning to be at home with that, particularly as ministers and in different spaces. I particularly think about religious education, but there are different spaces. And thinking about the example, if it's not enough to just say it and tell people, you gotta believe this, it's also making that sort of space, that hearkening to the ecological model, that they have to be able to feel this in different ways, right? And I'm thinking about like in religious education in particular, like I can't just like say this to the student and you gotta believe this. There's something about the space that has to help them feel safe. And also one of the things we talked about was paying attention to bodies and their particularity. And I appreciated at the start when you said, this is not just metaphorical, like this is at home in the body, it touches our bodies, and to take that seriously. And then the last point, I think, because we were talking about resources and just thinking about prayer can be very life-giving for people. But I think we have to admit that sometimes we need to talk about how to pray. A professor in another class was talking about lamentation, right? With everything that's happening in the world, that's part of the Christian tradition, but we don't have, maybe sometimes you just need to admit, how do you do this? Like, and telling the community about that, particularly as ministers. But I guess like my question is just something that came to mind is I've encountered something talking about courageous risk-taking as well. So, and this was someone who was trying to do trauma-informed work and was noting there's a lot of emphasis on safety. And so I'm wondering if this notion of courageous risk-taking is in line with that in your view, or what's some caution we need to take in terms of that language? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that the phrase courageous risk-taking is not only appropriate, but very helpful and reminds us of the strength-based approach and the focus on empowerment. So it may be a courageous risk to leave home and go out into a public space, just for example. Like some of you may have taken some risk to be here in person, right? So there are a lot of risks that we take for the sake of development and healing, and a lot of work that we need to do to discern when is it an appropriate risk and when are we ready to take it, and what support do we need to take it, what support do we need to offer for others to take it, to take risks together. So when are we ready to move, for example, from stage 1 to stage 2? Right? With all of these things, there's some practical wisdom and judgment that has to be made, but we can start by saying, like, I bet this is hard. This feels really hard for me. Right? I need courage for this, and like pump each other up. Use your power poses, whatever your subculture says is helpful, right? To get there. So being courageous without pushing people beyond their measure of comfort, right? Thank you. We can do questions or continued comments or reflections from the table now, whatever you'd like. We're coming to the end, and so you get to look at the tree again.
Hi, we have a couple questions from the online audience. The first one, I think this is in reference to your triangle diagram that you had up before. So just to clarify, in the context of trauma, is a fruitful relationship with God possible without life-affirming relationships, like with the neighbor?
Mm-hmm. I think that it is very hard, I'm not going to say impossible, nothing's impossible with God, but it is very hard to encounter a loving God if one has not had loving environments and loving relationships. So it is possible that one recalls a prior loving relationship with neighbor as one manifests prayer, right? So if the question was about, does one have to have an active loving relationship to neighbors, to physical people, in order to have a loving relationship to God? I don't think so, right? Lots of times we remember a moment of love. We remember that teacher or that minister who smiled at us and reminded us that we're lovable, right? And that is sort of channeled into our prayer. So we can pray and have a loving relationship with God even amidst hostile environments. That's super important, right? That if you're in a family context in which you don't feel loved, but you know you have the love of God, that is a life-saving mechanism. But the love has to come at some point. We can't get anything out of the pure blue sky, right? There has to be some sort of contact at some point, but that can happen in so many different ways. A lot of people who have experienced severe trauma do therapy with animals because people don't feel safe. But dogs and horses apparently are really great. So there are lots of ways to have that encounter and that to be reflected and manifest in prayer.
Great, thank you. So another question has to do with, getting a sense for these holy stirrings for growth in a mature and more healthy sort of ecclesiology. How do we do that within the institution of the church that often resists or dismantles them or something like that?
Can you repeat the very beginning? What is the very first word you used?
So I think this person is responding to just the, considering the information that you've been talking about, we have a stirring within ourselves to grow in a more mature, healthy kind of church. Mm-hmm. And then how do we do that when there are institutional forces that are opposed to it?
Sure. So there's always more than one story. There's a great TED Talk about that if you're interested. But there's always more going on than what is happening in my immediate environment, for better and for worse. So if I am in a very unsupportive environment, I can know that there are other church settings, faith settings, spiritual settings, human settings. There are other spaces, right? And vice versa. If I'm in an amazing space, I want to be conscious that this is not the same for everywhere. So how can we grow this? How can we share this? And so that happens even within what may seem like a uniform structure. So the Catholic Church is huge. And there are so many different spaces that are interconnected but distinct. So if you are in one church setting, or if you are in one spiritual conversation using certain kinds of literatures and theologies, know that there's more, right? And don't confine yourself to simply what you know right now. That would be my start towards an answer.
Great, thank you.
One final question.
Thank you so much. This was a really rich morning. It's kind of a question, something we were talking about and related to this image and this idea of resources in the church. We talked a lot about different wounds that are present in the church, either invisible or visible, which we talked about throughout your presentation. So different communities, what they've experienced, either abuses within church structures or without, but bringing it into the church structure. And so we all have different needs, and we all have different wounds and sufferings. And, wishing and hoping and dreaming for a church that can learn from these wounds together with this subsidiarity and solidarity. And I don't know what the sort of concrete question is. There's a lot percolating right now, but kind of like, how do we do it? How do we be it, as teachers, as ministers, as clinicians? And how do we try to bridge that orthodoxy and orthopraxy? So like kind of pie in the sky, like what would you do if you could sort of do something to impact both the institutional church and these communities and like root systems? So what kind of a vision is there that we can have? How can we take steps as individuals? How do we do sort of like ecclesiology in this way? I have a lot of questions here. So anything you want to add more on in one of those dynamics would be really great, because we had a really rich conversation.
I'll answer, and if we have time and you're unsatisfied, I'll try again. But I honestly think that the best answer for most questions is twofold. Baby steps. Celebrate small steps. Build strength upon strength. Don't try to leap and jump. Take one step at a time. And communicate. We often presume a focus on something that is over here when we have not yet fully developed the communication processes that can get us there. We sort of assume we can communicate. That's basic. It's really not. Most of us are bad at it. And I'm trained in it, and I'm still bad at it, especially with the people that I love most. So communication and baby steps. Learning from each other about what good communication looks like and testing it and practicing and honoring that as the work itself, not just like preparation that we have to get over with, but really that is the work. If we communicate, then we build relationships. And what are relationships? The means of healing and prevention.
Amen. Please join me in thanking Professor DuBois.